Spanish-American War. In this lecture, I'm going to address Virginia SOL US 2.5a. I'm going to take a closer look at the reasons for and the result of the Spanish-American War. A couple of essential questions that I would like you to think about during this lecture are: what were the reasons for the Spanish-American War, and what were the results of the Spanish-American War? So I want you to really think about the causes and effects of the war. Now, when it comes to the Spanish-American War, it has its roots in the growing independence movements throughout Latin America. Cuba is one of the last colonies of what was once the great Spanish Empire in the Americas, and it really starts going away. And in 1892, Jose Marti, who was from Cuba, organizes the Cuban Revolutionary Party in New York City with the desire of Cuba getting its independence from Spain. So they start plotting the revolution there. In 1895, Marti returns to Cuba to participate in the revolt against Spain, and he's killed in the Battle of Dos Rios, but he becomes basically a martyr. He becomes a hero among the Cuban people. In 1896, things really start getting out of hand in Cuba. Spain begins to place Cuban civilians in camps where thousands die. These camps are very similar to what we'll get seen later in World War I and especially in World War II, very similar to the concentration camps of the Germans or even the Japanese during World War II. Very poor living conditions, many of the prisoners being starved to death, that sort of thing. 1897, the New York Journal and the New York World stir up anti-Spanish sentiment with yellow journalism. It's called yellow journalism in part because the paper that was used to print newspapers at the time was yellow. Now, yellow journalism specifically refers to the sensational type journalism in the late 1800s as it related to the Spanish-American War. And sometimes this journalism kind of went an extra step and exaggerated stories to the point of sometimes portraying non-truths. The American public began to sympathize with the Cubans' desire for independence, and the United States government desired to protect American business interests in Cuba, which were numerous. So, following that, in January 1898, President McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to protect the U.S. citizens after riots broke out in Cuba. Not long after that, February 15th, the USS Maine explodes due to unknown causes in Havana Harbor. And many Americans were outraged, and they began to blame the Spanish. The newspapers jumped right on it. And a variety of stories came out as to what caused this. Some historians and archaeologists now believe, based on what they've been able to find from the wreck, that it may have actually been a boiler that had exploded. So a complete accident, but fitting with the times of the late 1800s, what was going on in Cuba between the Spanish and the Americans. It's easy to see how people quickly people were willing to place blame. April 20th, 1898, McKinley signs a congressional resolution demanding Spain's withdrawal from Cuba. 3 days later, McKinley calls for 125,000 volunteers to aid in the war effort. So the United States is gearing up for a war with Spain. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey orders the American fleet to open fire on Manila, the capital of the Spanish colony in the Philippines. Now, this seems kind of odd given the fact that the conflict seemed to originally revolve around Cuba. And the conflict seemed to be, okay, the United States is fighting Spain because of what's going on in Cuba. But the war was quickly expanded to include the Philippines, which was completely on the other side of the world. The Americans defeat the Spanish squadron in 7 hours with no American deaths. So the Spanish were greatly outmatched in that conflict. In June 13th, 1898, Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders leave Tampa, Florida for Santiago, Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt basically led a group of volunteers known as the Rough Riders to give their services to the war effort. June 15th, the American Anti-Imperialist League began to oppose the annexation of the Philippines, believing the United States should not deny others the right to govern themselves. After all, one of the reasons the United States had gotten into the war with Spain was the idea that the Cubans wanted independence. That at least was what everybody initially thought was going on. But soon after the Battle of Manila, talk was going on in the United States that perhaps the United States should take the Philippines as its own colony, just as it had once been Spain's colony. July 1st, 1898, Teddy Roosevelt leads his Rough Riders and African-American soldiers from the 10th Cavalry rush to capture the strategic location of San Juan Hill, known as the Battle of San Juan Hill. July 17th, General Santiago surrenders after American ships destroy the Spanish fleet, attempting to escape Santiago Harbor. So they cut off the escape route for him, and that basically really ceases the hostilities between the Spanish and the Americans. Spain signs a truce after the United States takes Puerto Rico in August of 1898. And then by December of 1898, Spain gives up Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands to the United States, and Cuba is granted its independence. And the United States proves its status as a world power, having beat a European power, albeit a European power that is only a shadow of its former self, and it expands its territories in much the same way that Great Britain and France had been doing during most of the 19th century. So, in summary, the United States emerged as a world power as a result of its victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War. Economic interest and public opinion influenced the United States' involvement in international affairs, with the Spanish-American War being the best example of that towards the end of the 1800s. That is all for this lecture.